Hi, I'm Jonathan Russell Anelli. I'm a soil scientist at Cornell University, and today we're going to continue our conversation about nutrient analysis and submissions, how you submit, and what the results mean. We've already actually done a video on how you submit, but I just wanted to do a real quick review. We're going to be submitting to Dairy 1, or we actually already have submitted to Dairy 1. Dairy 1 is one of many commercial laboratories that will take soil samples and do nutrient analysis and give you interpretations for what's in your soil for your crops, or i.e. so you have an idea about soil fertilizer and things like that. Dairy 1 is a good example in that it also provides a lot of different types of sampling availability. So the D stands for dairy here, T for turf, fruit, horticulture, and A for annual. There's another one that is V for vegetable. That's the one we actually submitted earlier. But I just wanted to remind people that there's a lot of different type of soil testing that's going on out there. Dairy 1, as well as all the other labs, also supply basically key codes, codes for the vegetable or plant material that you're interested in. And you need to make sure that you give them all the information they want about the soil, but also you give them the information code-wise about the vegetation, the plants that you're willing to or you want to grow. So with that in mind, what I want to show you now is some of those results. So let me slide these to the side. Put these up here. And here are two results. And the first thing I want you guys to notice here when you look at these guys is actually the letters. The letters are key to the test themselves. So V for vegetable, H for homeowners. The results themselves, the actual format of it looks actually very, very similar. The only real difference is when they start talking about how much fertilizer you need to add. In the vegetable one, or the commercial vegetable one, they look at it at pounds, how many pounds per acre you need to add. In the homeowner one, they basically say pounds per 100 square feet. It's basically a relative reference to how much, of a raised bed versus an agricultural field that you have. And so what I want to do now is basically walk you through what these results mean and basically the different components of it. The very first thing you should do, strangely enough, is actually to make sure that this is your result. So basically go up to this top right area and look at the field location and look at the statement ID or whoever it is. Make sure that is in fact you. Once you've done that, the second thing you want to do is basically look at the soil. Now with the homeowners one, we don't actually ask you what the particular soil series is. We ask you what type of soil texture it is. And so for this one, John Jones, the soil texture would be clay. For the vegetable ones, which is sort of the South Field one, basically tells us that the soil is a Langford. That's the soil series. Okay, so from there on, let's actually just sort of walk through each component. The first part is this top sort of bar graph thing that you see here, and you'll note that the elements that they're interested in, this is from your test results, is phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And the bars basically represent how much of that nutrient is in that field, and it's a relative to its fertility. They give you actually an estimate of how much is the absolute value, and then they give you this bar graph that gives you an idea about the relative value of this towards your vegetables. So in this case, you see phosphorus is fairly high. High is not necessarily bad, and you'll notice that calcium is fairly low. Again, that's not necessarily bad. It's what it is. Okay. Now, you'll note that on the bar graph it says very low, low, optimum, high, and very high. Very high is actually probably something that you really don't want to be going towards. You potentially could have leaching, you could probably maybe have some problems with your plants. Obviously, if it's low and very low, you probably don't have enough nutrients for your plants. Optimum and high are actually fairly okay in a sense. Actually, low is okay as well. You can always add to make it up. Optimum basically means this is the optimum amount of nutrients that your plants needs for right now. That doesn't mean that this is the entire growing season, but right now, this is what you need. High usually means that you have enough of this nutrient for the entire growing season. They explain it different ways, but that's in essence what they're saying. So when you see optimum, and I also should note that on the results, sometimes this, instead of saying optimum, it will say medium. But optimum, medium basically mean that sort of middle road. This is where you're trying to target for your plants right now. Then you move farther down, and you sort of this second sort of matrix here, and there's a number of different pieces of information in here. One is, and probably very importantly, is the pH. Basically gives you what the pH of this soil is. Now, for this vegetable field, the pH is basically a 5.4, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then for the horticultural one, or the homeowner's one, you see that you have a pH of 7.4. Both of these are slightly off of optimum, but both of them are actually really well within sort of acceptable ranges for production. You might want to raise in the case of the Langford and lower in the case of the homeowners, but those are fairly acceptable ranges. You'll see some other numbers in here, specifically with the vegetable crop. It says here right up below soil pH, it says buffer pH. And it says buffer pH is 5.9. That's ideally the target that you should be, or I should say the minimum target range that you really want for your pH for your soil. But you'll notice that the homeowner one doesn't have that. That's because in this case, they don't feel that there is a real concern that you need to change the pH. In this one, we're going to be growing tomatoes, and a pH of 5.4 for tomatoes is probably not in the optimum range. You probably want to have it at minimum 5.9. Now, they will talk farther on, and we'll talk about this in a moment as well. We'll talk a little bit later about how you will actually manage for that. But right now, this is just what the results are. You also notice that there's iron, manganese, zinc, aluminum numbers in here as well. These aren't, these are just basically values. They tell you what's there. To be perfectly honest, there's not a lot of really good sort of research on this that says this is the value that you want, this is the value that you don't want. Sort of the rule of thumb is when you have iron, manganese, and aluminum above about 150 pounds per acre, you might have some toxicity issues, but these numbers are well below that, so not something that we really should be worrying about. The last number here is percent organic matter, and you notice that in the homeowners we're basically looking at 2.9, but in the vegetable one we're basically looking at 13.8. 13.8 is a fairly high number for a field crop. It makes me think that they're probably spreading manure or something like that. Just to give you size a ballpark, I've got a little table here. This is from the Soil Health Lab, Cornell Soil Health Lab, basically out of their manual. And if you look at this chart right here, if you look at your soil textures here, sand versus silt versus clay, they give you a ballpark of what their percentages actually mean. So with the sand, if you're below 2.3% organic matter, you probably have a fairly low organic for your sand. Again, if you're above 3.2, it's probably pretty high. This Langford soil, texture-wise, it's sort of a loamy in the middle of the range, so probably more on the silty end, and you'll notice here that it says above 3.3 is fairly high organic matter, and we look at this percent organic matter and it's 13.8. So they have a lot of organic matter. That's not necessarily bad. In fact, it could be good, but you should sort of think about what could be going on that actually makes that that organic matter so high. All right, so that's basically our results. The next component is basically sort of code information about what you want to grow. So this case, in this field, for example, there is no crop history here, but they are interested in growing tomatoes. And we have a Langford soil. It tells us that there's no tillage depth here. The drainage is fairly good. We don't know if there was any legumes put in. And then just catching what you submitted, making sure that it's there. The next piece of information is actually the recommendations. This is where they're going to tell you how much X, Y, and Z, or nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as well as potentially liming agents, you need to put on this field for optimum growth. Okay, now, the crop here, tons of lime per acre, 3.5 tons of lime. Now that's a number that is basically estimated to say if I'm at a pH of 5.4 and I want to get to a pH of 5.9, that is how much tons of lime I need to add per acre to get to that value. Okay, nitrogen is the next one. You'll notice that up here that we didn't talk about nitrogen, and I explained why we don't talk about nitrogen in the submissions. But again, remember, nitrogen is so variable and in so many different forms that it's hard to test for, and more importantly, because it changes from day to day, in a sense, is almost meaningless. But because we have lots of data on how these plants perform and across the state, we do have a very good idea about how much nitrogen a tomato, in this case, would need to be productive. So in this case, if you're on a Langford soil and you're in Nassau County, you probably need about 190 pounds per acre of nitrogen for that tomato over the growing season. Now that's a key sentence that I said right there. I said over the growing season. Keep that in mind, because when we start getting into this comment section, they're actually going to talk about the timing of how you do this application, whether it's lime or the fertilizer. The next one is phosphorus. Okay, and this suggestion here is 20 pounds per acre for phosphorus, and potassium, they're basically making a recommendation of 120 pounds per acre. Now, the next section here is basically a comments, and I'm not going to go through each one of these because it would be totally boring, but it's very important that you look at these comments. The comments basically give you an idea about when and how much you should apply during the growing season. You can certainly imagine that if you applied all of your nitrogen at the very beginning of the season and you just planted your seeds, most of that nitrogen is going to go straight through the soil, and you just spent a lot of money on nitrogen to basically eutrophy downstream. Talking about the environmental consequence of that is another conversation, but you just lost a lot of money. Okay, so the real consideration here is how you add these nutrients and at what timing. Now, plants, just like us, have a life cycle. There are certain stages of their life that they need more or less of nutrients, okay? And the timing that they talk about here is basically reflective of that life cycle. When do they flower? When do they sprout? When do they fruit? All of those types of things are integrated into this comment section, okay? It's really, I know they call it comments, but it's really, I think, should be recommendations for application. And I want to show you this. This is a two-sided document. I'm going to flip it over. This is actually out of Cooperative Extension. This is Cornell Cooperative Extension. And it basically is a little sort of cheat sheet or an explanatory bulletin to explain what these results forms are from Dairy One, to help you sort of read it. I'm hoping that obviously you've watched the video, but I'm hoping if you really have some more questions that you can go online and find this. Basically, type in "Understanding Your Agro One Soil Test Results," say Cornell Cooperative Extension. But pretty much everything I just talked about, and they'll talk a little bit more about in detail, just to give you sort of another way to get some more better information. And with that, I will actually say goodbye, and as I've been reminded, I should tell you, be awesome.